As a small business owner, sometimes it feels like no matter how much planning you do, there's always surprises, like an urgent, expensive repair. But here's the surprise you will like. With Progressive, small business owners save 13% on their commercial auto insurance when they pay in full. So enjoy a surprise for once. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
I have a couple of things I want to tell you about today before we get started. The first is that I have launched a Substack. If you are a person that likes reading things and not just hearing things, I'd love for you to check out my Substack. You can subscribe for free or get additional content that is more in-depth if you take a paid subscription. You can go to skepticpastor.substack.com. That's skepticpastor.substack.com. I'd also like to invite you to a retreat that I am doing. It is a small and intimate retreat, just like 16 people or so. It's going to be in the Dallas-Fort Worth area on March the 27th through the 29th. Now, you have to travel to get there, however you do that, but the retreat fee will cover all of your lodging, all of your food, and everything else for the event, including a pre-release copy of my next book that is going to be coming out on April 14th called Rituals for Heretics, Atheists, and People Who Aren't Sure About God. We're going to do some spiritual practices. We're going to actually have some time to rest and just get to hang out and meet with each other. I would love for you to be there. There are early bird rates and middle rates like happens with these kinds of events. So the earlier you register, the cheaper it's going to be and the more likely you are to get a space. So if you want to do that, you can go to my social media profiles, click on those links in my profiles, and there is a link to register for that retreat. I would love to see you there. Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast. Today we are talking about the fact that Jesus didn't have to die. This whole area of thinking and understanding is something called atonement theory. And there is this popular idea that Jesus had to die that the evangelicals will promote. The way that is phrased, the title for it is something called penal substitutionary atonement. This is something that a lot of people assume, even if they didn't grow up in the evangelical world, if they don't go to church, because it is something that is sort of the default that somebody has heard at some point or some commenter on social media has said. And it basically is this, that humanity is completely separated from God because of their sin. And humanity's sin makes God incredibly angry. And that anger is vengeance. That anger requires blood sacrifice. But the problem is that the sacrifice has to be perfect in order to work. And humanity can't be a perfect sacrifice because they are sinful. And the punishment for this is spiritual death. So what has to happen is a perfect sacrifice has to be offered. Now, that sacrifice comes in the form of God's Son. So the penal substitutionary atonement says that God sends God's Son to the earth to live a perfect life so that then Jesus can die and his blood sacrifice can be substituted for humanity, that the punishment of humanity is transferred to Jesus. And so then there is no punishment. Jesus's death and resurrection washes the sins away and humanity can once again be connected with God. The problem of this is that God is kind of awful, right? God seems like an abusive parent, sending God's son down to be tortured and die a gruesome death. That is awful. And here's the thing, though the argument is simple and is often well constructed by the evangelicals, this is not the only way that the sacrifice of Jesus is understood. There are many, many different ways that the sacrifice of Jesus can be understood. That I should say, not the sacrifice, the death and resurrection of Jesus can be understood and has been understood since the earliest days of Christianity. So I'm going to go through a couple of those. I'm not going to be telling you which model you should accept, but instead, I really want to show you that the cross has been understood in many ways, many of which are less violent, less legalistic, and frankly, more hopeful than the version that many of us were taught as evangelicals, or you may have heard from evangelical pastors. So as we go along, I'm going to invite you to notice how these models assume the problem is not that God needs somebody to be punished, but something else entirely. That humanity needs healing or liberation or transformation, reconciliation, awakening. And so we're going to start with one of the earliest ideas. It's something called recapitulation. And this comes from a guy named Irenaeus in the 2nd century. And his basic idea is that Jesus does not just die for humanity. Instead, Jesus is living the human life faithfully from beginning to end and sort of redoes the human story. Like, the idea is that at the very beginning, humanity went off track, and Christ steps into the story to set it back on course. So in this recapitulation model, salvation is less like a courtroom verdict, like this legal transaction that has to be done, and more like, I don't know, like a medical healing process. Like humanity is sick, distorted, bent out of shape, and Jesus restores what humanity could not restore on its own. So in this way of looking at the cross and the resurrection, the cross is the final moment of faithful obedience that completes this healing work. And then humanity gets the opportunity to enter into this healing, this restoration that Jesus brought through the cross and the resurrection. So this is different from the idea of penal substitutionary atonement, because this is not saying that God needs to punish somebody, that God is a vengeful God, that sin requires death and blood. Instead, this is that humanity needs restoration. And the cross isn't a legal transaction, but sort of the culmination of a life that was lived to repair what was broken. So once Christians began thinking about salvation as healing, they also began thinking about salvation as liberation. So there's another way of looking at the cross from very early on. Early Christians frequently describe salvation using freedom language. And this understanding is called the ransom theory of the atonement. So in this way of looking at it, humanity is trapped in destructive patterns, trapped in systems of injustice, trapped in mortality itself, trapped in the fear of death. And the life of Jesus, the cross, the resurrection is sort of a rescue mission that is meant to set people free. So, like when Jesus talks about giving his life as a ransom for many, the emphasis is not on the punishment, right? The emphasis is on release. The emphasis is on freedom. And so this idea that something has humanity in chains that create evil, injustice, and oppression, and that God is breaking those chains. And so the way this is different from this understanding of this evangelical understanding of the cross, like penal substitutionary atonement imagines this transaction where somebody has to be sentenced to death and there is blood required. This ransom theory of the atonement imagines instead not a judgment that needs to happen, but a prison where somebody needs to be freed. And I love this because it shifts the emotional tone from guilt and penalty to rescue and liberation. That liberation theme develops into one of the most really like dramatic early Christian interpretations. So we're still in very early Christianity. These ways of looking at the cross and the resurrection have been going on since the very earliest, since the 200s and the 300s, right? And the next one is something called Christus Victor. This Christus Victor theory of the atonement expands on this liberation idea. So in Christus Victor, the cross and the resurrection together represent God's decisive victory over the powers that dominate human life, right? A decisive victory over sin and death, empire, violence, oppression, fear, and basically a decisive victory over all of the forces that keep people enslaved. It makes me think of that part from the movie The Matrix, right? Where Morpheus is telling Neo, "You are a slave," and you don't even realize it. And that's where Christus Victor is landing. This way of thinking about the cross and the resurrection of Jesus, it says that, basically, it's like Jesus' death is not the end of the story. The resurrection reveals that the forces that killed Jesus don't ultimately win. Right? The sources of empire and death and violence, oppression, fear, all of that, they don't ultimately win. These evil systems may appear to be powerful, but they are not final. This is hugely different from the idea of penal substitutionary atonement that is all about sin, and the sacrifice of Jesus was about dealing with this sinful separation from God. And it pushes this into saying that God is overthrowing systems that crucify people, right? The cross is not a payment. It is a battle scene where oppressive powers are exposed and defeated, right? I mean, there are so many great ways of understanding this that don't end with God being this abusive father figure. And people just don't know about them because they've only heard one and they haven't really thought that there might be another way. They haven't been exposed to it. So this is really early Christianity. When we move into the medieval period in Europe, thinkers began to explore philosophical explanations of the cross. But those that didn't originally begin with the idea of divine rage and punishment. So one of those that develops is the satisfaction theory of the atonement. Saint Anselm focuses on the idea that human injustice damages the moral fabric of creation, the moral fabric of the universe. He says that basically humanity fails to live in the justice and trust and faithfulness that sustain life together, sustain the human life lived in community. And this satisfaction theory of the atonement says that Christ's life and death restore the damaged moral order by offering perfect faithfulness where humanity failed. So in this framework, Jesus's self-giving obedience restores what humanity has broken. The emphasis here is on restoration, not punishment. And the idea that Jesus' life and death and resurrection is a model. It is an invitation into faithfulness, into restoring what God wants for humanity. So it's not like penal substitutionary atonement that that is like punishment that's transferred from humanity to Jesus. Satisfaction theory of the atonement focuses more on restoring what was damaged rather than executing a penalty. So around the same period in the Middle Ages, another theologian looked at the cross and saw something even more relational. Peter Abelard has this theory of the atonement called the moral influence theory. And he argued that the cross is the clearest possible demonstration of divine love. And he says this, he has this foundational idea that I think most people have experienced in some way, that humanity changes not when somebody gets punished, but because when you encounter deep, radical love, that changes you. And in the case of the story of Jesus, the radical love will awaken repentance and change, transformation. And this, I think you can have like an insight here from psychology, right? That people rarely become better because they're threatened, right? Like the idea has been debunked a million times over that corporal punishment in parenting actually helps kids change and learn. It doesn't, right? People don't become better because they are threatened or because they are scared. People become better when they experience love and acceptance that invites them into a different way of living or being in the world. So here, it's different from this idea of penal substitutionary atonement, because instead of forgiveness depending on punishment, forgiveness really, it has a completely different function. Like, forgiveness is the catalyst that transforms the human heart. The cross becomes the revelation of love rather than the satisfaction of God's anger and wrath. And it becomes that invitation, an invitation to be more loving, to be more like Jesus, to fight for justice and change from a place of love for humanity. Yeah. So then we go forward from the Middle Ages. Later, thinkers want to basically hold together forgiveness and moral seriousness without requiring the idea that Jesus literally absorbed a criminal sentence, right? So there's this other theory of the atonement that comes out of that period called the governmental theory of atonement. And this idea argues that the cross demonstrates that injustice matters and that forgiveness is not trivial. God, in this way of looking at the cross, takes sin seriously while extending mercy, right? There is not a lack of accountability. There is not a lack of taking morality and sin seriously, but there is mercy. In this view, the cross is less like a legal penalty that is paid instead of humanity, and more like a public demonstration that moral order is real and meaningful. So, different from penal substitutionary atonement in that Jesus is not punished in humanity's place, like in a strict legal sense. Instead, the cross really upholds moral seriousness as a demonstration while allowing for forgiveness to remain genuine. Then in like modern theology, there's more ways of thinking about this. There's one of them called the scapegoat theory of the atonement. This idea looks at the fact that human societies often maintain unity by blaming a victim, right? We take some person or some group of people and turn them into the other. And because we can point at them and say they are the bad ones, then we that are pointing at them are unified against this other that we have defined. And this scapegoat theory of the atonement, in this theory, the cross reveals that mechanism clearly, right? A crowd, and then political pressure, religious justification of this evil that is being perpetrated, an innocent person being executed for the sake of stability of the empire and of the populace, right? All of that is exposing this mechanism of that humanity often uses to maintain unity, right? By blaming a victim, right? In this case, it is blaming Jesus. And what this argues is that the resurrection functions as a divine reversal of the crowd's verdict and all of that injustice. And like the cross is revealing that the scapegoat was innocent and the system is unjust. So this is different from penal substitutionary atonement, obviously, because in that it is God requiring a scapegoat. It is God requiring a sacrifice, a person on which all of the evil can be placed, and then all of the wrath of God can be placed, and that the death of that scapegoat is what satisfies God's wrath, right? That's the penal substitutionary atonement. Whereas the scapegoat theory is saying the exact opposite, that the cross is revealing humanity's tendency to create scapegoats. And in a way, this theory of the atonement is saying, like, look, that whole penal substitutionary atonement theory, that is humanity taking this very unholy, very unjust tendency to require a scapegoat and interpreting the Bible through that unjust lens, interpreting God through that unjust lens. And the cross is actually there to expose that, that is sinful, that in itself is evil and is part of the problem. And then we'll do one more, one that I really like, called the solidarity theory of the atonement. And this is this idea that what we see in the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus is deep systemic injustice, right? You have Jesus brought up on false charges by a corrupt religious system. And then this legal system recognizes that, but is also corrupt and unjust. And even though the legal system recognizes that Jesus is not guilty of this, it convicts him anyway and sentences Jesus to death. And Jesus is a victim of systemic injustice, like all of the people that have been victims of injustice throughout history, and all of the people that would be victims of injustice in the future in history. And so what this theory of the atonement says is that what Jesus does here is Jesus actively chooses to stand with the victims of injustice, with the victims of systemic injustice and evil throughout all of time. And he is standing in solidarity with them in the cross. He is allowing himself to become a victim of injustice to the utter extent that injustice can impose the death of a human being, and then exposes the evil through the resurrection. So yeah, there's a bunch of ways to look at the death and the resurrection of Jesus that is not God being this abusive father. That, in fact, is, I think, an exposure of a theological system that is problematic, right? Like a theological system that relies on a violent and vengeful God is a theological system that can justify violence and oppression as divine. If God wants violence, it is okay for us to want violence. And that can be violence in terms of war, but also violence in terms of emotional and relational violence. And so when you view the cross in this God being vengeful and violent and needing a blood sacrifice, it messes with the whole thing. If salvation is about God wanting you to die and then sending God's son, like an abusive father, to pay that price, man, if that's what salvation is about, that's hard to swallow, right? That's not a a God that a lot of people really are interested in or that would see as loving. But so many Christians don't see it that way, don't interpret that way. They find a loving God who is fighting against systems of injustice, that is coming to stand in solidarity with the oppressed, to heal humanity in a loving way. Yeah. So I hope this helps. I hope this has helped you as you are processing your own faith. And one of the things I hope that it shows is that really in every aspect of theology, there are multiple ways of understanding something. And when you find something problematic, it might not be because God is actually an abusive father. It might be that you've only heard one voice on the matter. And maybe it's time to pause and to do a little research, to do a little digging, and to see, are there widely accepted other ways of looking at this? And the cross is definitely one of them.